There is a stretch of country in the Kollegal Taluk of Coimbatore district where a strange, and to me undeniably pleasant, phenomenon takes place, almost every night of the year, summer or winter, be the weather dry or squally. This strange occurrence begins almost punctually at 10 p.m. and ceases as abruptly at 3 in the morning. The occurrence to which I refer is a strong breeze, reaching almost to the proportions of a mild gale, that blows from west to east, descending violently in the manner of an approaching storm, from the cold heights of the Bilagiri-Rangan Mountains to the west, better known as the Blue Hills of Ranga, and sweeping across a wide plain of jungle, roadway and cultivated land, to be lost again in mountains and more jungles in the valley of the Kaveri River, far to the east. What's so strange about a breeze, you may ask? Well, for one thing, you can almost set your watch by its beginning or its end. Secondly, imagine an all-pervading stillness over hill and dale, forest and plain, suddenly shattered each night at a fixed time by a wail that rises to a howl. Then the wind is upon you. It blows and blows for 5 hours, then ceases almost abruptly, as if at the turn of a switch, at the end of that time. The singularity of the phenomenon has to be experienced to be believed. No doubt there is a natural explanation, but I do not know it. Yet it is a wonderful experience, welcomed by the weary hunter, hot and tired, after trekking miles all day in the scorching heat. No doubt our villain thought this too, for he settled down in Windy Valley, in the forests at the foot of the Bilagiri-Rangan Mountains to the west, from where he practiced his villainy throughout a wide area, not only during the hours when the gale reigned supreme, but at all times of the night and day, whenever he got the chance. This villain was a tiger, as you must have guessed by now, and the locale of this story, a region in the district of Coimbatore, measuring roughly 55 miles, from the outskirts of Kollegal town, in the north to the Dimbum escarpment further south, and about the same distance between the Blue Hills of Ranga, to the west across flat jungle and plain, and then through very rugged hilly country, eastwards, to the Kaveri River. In the center of this flat region, situated between forest land to the west and cultivated areas to the east, are the two villages of Lakanahalli and Baylor. The first is 17 miles south of Kollegal, and the second a further 16 miles or so south of Lakanahalli. These villages are in the midst of the domain of the nightly squalls, and around and between them the tiger began his career of misdeeds, and there they ended ultimately when he paid the penalty. The villain was born on the high ranges to the west. At the top of this chain of mountains, at about 5,000 feet, are a number of coffee estates, founded years ago by a great English sportsman, who carved them out of the heart of primeval forest land, and converted them into some of the most profitable vested interests in southern India. In those days, the jungle teemed with game: elephant, bison, tiger, panther, and deer of all varieties. The last mentioned were so abundant that the carnivore had more than enough to eat, and confined themselves almost exclusively to a diet of venison and wild pig. Then came civilization. Forests were felled ruthlessly, roads appeared, with the inevitable automobile, the jeep, the flashlight, and prolific poaching by day and night. Deer were slaughtered in hundreds, and with their decimation the natural prey of the wild beasts became increasingly scarce. Along with the clearing of the forests and the building of roads, greater areas of grassland cropped up, attracting vast herds of domestic cattle and buffaloes. Necessity has always been the mother of invention, and with the advent of these domestic herds, the tigers and panthers for miles around, who until then had only rarely turned to cattle lifting, became confirmed beef eaters, killing a deer as seldom now as they had killed a cow or a buffalo in days gone by. Sholaga Aborigines, living in hamlets on the outskirts of the estate, frequently reported that they found the pug marks of a tigress, accompanied by a half-grown cub, along the footpaths and old game trails that covered the region. The tracks of the two beasts were found early in the morning, while other Sholagas returning late in the evenings said that they observed the pug marks of mother and son, superimposed on the trail of hooves left in the sand by their domestic cattle and buffaloes, as they were driven home at sundown. This meant that the two tigers were more or less unaccustomed to beef, but were also mustering the courage to try some. The desire found its attainment sooner than expected, and in full measure, when in a few weeks, domestic bulls, cows and buffaloes, in increasing numbers, began to fall prey to the two tigers. With no restraint upon their activities, these animals worked together as a team, hunting, killing and eating in unison. In the course of time, the male cub, shortly to be nicknamed by the frightened Sholagas as the villain, grew in size and skill. Perhaps the meat afforded by the single victim that his mother and he brought down together proved insufficient for both. Maybe he wanted to show off his own prowess. Whatever the reason, the young tiger started to kill separately and thereafter did most of the killing himself, allowing his mother a morsel here and there for old time's sake. All this while he was still growing, and when he reached full maturity, he soon forgot his obligations to the mother who, in any case, was not as big as himself and could no longer exercise her authority over him. He snarled and bit if she dared to approach the kill he had made. This change in the attitude of her offspring forced the tigress to hunt for herself, which she was well able to do, being but middle-aged and physically very capable. The death roll now inflicted on the domestic herds of the Sholagas became double what it had been before. These continued depredations at last aroused the anger of the local people to the extent that they determined to do something about them. Being skilled in jungle craft for countless generations, the Sholagas knew all about the habits of the animals in their forests and soon thought out a clever way to destroy their oppressors. With the advice and active assistance of an aged expert who lived in the village of La Kanahali at the foot of the mountain range, the hill men who had come down to consult manufactured a crude bomb, the destructive power of which lay in the chunks of iron and lead that were packed within it. This roughly made missile they treasured carefully till the right moment presented itself. The moment came at last after 9 more of their cattle had fallen to the two tigers. Victim number 10, thought to have been killed by the young tiger who was regarded as the more destructive of the two marauders, turned out to be exactly the type of victim that the scheming bomb makers had been waiting for all this time. It was a fine, fat-milking cow in her prime. Her owners, the 3 enterprising herdsmen who had been with their cattle when the beast stampeded as the tiger launched itself upon the cow, had run together to the scene of the killing. There they saw a large tigress crouched beside the body of her new kill. Yelling and brandishing their staves, the 3 Sholagas very pluckily tried to beat off the killer. Taken aback by the charging men, the tigress lost her nerve, panicked and leapt into the undergrowth, disappearing from view. 2 of the herdsmen remained with the carcass to protect it against the return of the killer by daylight, while the 3rd Sholaga hastened to tell the bomb makers of what had happened. Chuckling with pleasure, the demolition squad hurried with their contraption to where the young cow was lying. Yes, indeed, they agreed, after glancing briefly at the victim, nothing could be better. A milking cow was just what was wanted to bring their clever plan into execution. Their long wait had been rewarded. Deftly they slit the udder, from which the milk spurted, forced the bomb that was as large as a cricket ball inside, and started to sew it up again with needle and thread. They finished at last and felt they had done a good job. The tigress bit the udder and the homemade bomb, unlike most homemade fireworks, that fail when pressed into service, exploded with devastating effect. It blasted the jaws of the tigress apart, leaving a gaping hole where snout and nostrils had been before, but failed to kill the poor beast outright. The stricken tigress could not roar, and it was reported that horrible gurgling sounds issued from her mangled face and head for the next 3 days, while she covered the bushes and the jungle grass, wherever she staggered, with gouts of blood. On the 4th day, the hideous noises and groans faded to silence. Mercifully, the tigress was dead. 2 days later, vultures circled the sky, and the rattling sound of the air passing through their pinions as they plummeted to earth caused the Sholagas to watch and to discover the whereabouts of the decomposing body. The jungle men found the carcass, only to realize that it was the tigress and not the young male that had been done to death by their ingenious bomb. Perhaps the tiger had been with his mother when the bomb had burst in her mouth. He must have seen or heard her during the 3 days of her agony. What is certain is that he became exceedingly crafty after that event. He rarely showed himself, slaying only isolated cattle or buffaloes that were grazing on the outskirts of a herd or had fallen to the rear. And when he killed, he gulped as much as possible of his victim there and then, and never returned for a second meal. Necessarily, these hurriedly eaten meals, during which the tiger was constantly on guard against the unexpected return of the herdsmen, were insufficient to satisfy his hunger completely. And because he never returned to finish his meal, he was never full or satisfied. This forced him to hunt and to kill more frequently, exacting a heavier toll on the herds of the surrounding Sholaga hamlets. A few sporadic attempts were made by local Nimrods, armed with muzzle-loading weapons, to rid the region of the wily and unwelcome visitor, but the greater the efforts to circumvent him, the craftier he became, and he seemed to develop brain as far-seeing and as cunning as those of any of the hunters who tried to encompass his end. Not only would he never return to a kill, but he carefully avoided touching any live bait tied out for him. He slipped out of every beat that was attempted. Instead of running away, he would charge the line of beaters, roaring at full pitch, to send them scuttling up the nearest trees. Soon people wagged their heads and named him the villain and Badmash Bagh in Hindustani, both terms signifying that the tiger was a rascal of the worst kind. But withal, he remained a cattle lifter and had not harmed a single human up to this stage of his story. So it came about that, except for his increasing nuisance to the Sholagas living at the summit of the mountain range and amidst the coffee estates, no one worried unduly about the villain, and the authorities did not even notice his existence. Or so it was until the rains came. With the advent of the southwest monsoon, the storm clouds banked and broke against the towering slopes, discharging their contents in unremitting torrential downpours. It grew bitterly cold, and almost continuous drizzling rain, accompanied by a heavy blanket of mist, enveloped the higher ranges. The Sholagas remained in their huts and kept their cattle with them. All these things caused the villain to become morose and restless, till he eventually decided to leave his old habitat. He was cold, he was wet, and he was very hungry indeed. So he came down from the mountains along a track that brought him to the main road about midway between the two hamlets of Lakanahali and Baylor, and to the region of the Indi Valley. Sheltered by the range to the west, the monsoon was less severe there, the fog and the cold were absent, and best of all, the local people did not lock themselves and their cattle indoors and were not aware of the fate that threatened them. The villain began to kill with his accustomed stealth. As the herds here were far more numerous than on the mountain tops, he waxed fat and sleek and contented. Very soon he forget his childhood home. But overindulgence and obesity in animals, as with human beings, bring their retribution. The tiger became lazy and overconfident in his attacks on the cattle and departed from his former cautious ways. Why waste good food, he thought, when unable to stuff himself further. He would return and finish what was left the next night. The Sholagas of the plains, who had heard from their kinsmen in the hills of the activities of a very cunning tiger, soon became aware that if this was the same animal, it had changed its habits radically. Alternatively, this was quite another beast. Anyway, the tiger grew increasingly bold. Among the Sholagas was a villager named American, who had a single-barreled .12 shotgun all his own. Many of his neighbors had muzzle-loading weapons, a few under license and the majority without, but American's gun was a breech loader and fully licensed. This gave him an exalted status in the field of sport, and thus was thrust upon him the responsibility for eliminating the menace that had come to afflict the cattlemen. The nightly wind was blowing with full force and heavy rain clouds scudded across the midnight sky, when American sat huddled with a friend on a machon overlooking the half-consumed carcass of a white and brown bull. the pride of a herd of some 100 animals owned by the Patel, or headman, of Lakanahali. But for the fact that the Patel was a man of importance, American would never have allowed himself to be coerced into such an unenviable position, for he was strictly a hunter of feathered game and rabbits. The only large animal he had ever shot was a sambar doe that had been pursued by a pack of wild dogs 2 years before. The hind had sought refuge from her relentless foes by dashing into the shallow lake just beyond the outskirts of the village. Boys had come running to American to tell him of the sambar's predicament, and he had forthwith gone and shot the poor beast. The Patel had insisted that American should avenge his bull. American, in turn, had pleaded indisposition, a severe stomachache, he said. But the Patel insisted. Thus he had been thrust into the Machan on a most inclement night. He might have avoided the situation by agreeing to lend his gun to a more willing hunter, but such a step could not be considered. He cursed the Patel, the tiger, the wind and the weather, as he awaited the coming of the tiger and the heavy downpour that threatened at any minute. They arrived together, the tiger and the rain. American could hear the great cat crunching the bones of his victim below despite the pattering of the raindrops on the leaves, and the howling crescendo of the night wind. The night was as black as pitch. American would have been wise, and incidentally would have saved many human lives, had he followed his inclination, which was to do nothing, as he could not see the tiger. But his companion kept prodding him in the ribs. American knew that if he did not at least fire a shot, this wretched individual would tell the whole village the next day. They would make fun of him and say he had been too scared to shoot. So he did the only possible thing under the circumstances. He pointed his weapon into the darkness beneath him, in the general direction of the sound of crunching bones, and fired. The mighty roars that followed, accompanied by the sound of a large beast floundering about, threshing the bushes, made clear to the scared men on the tree that at least one of the chance shots had taken effect and that the tiger was wounded. The noises died away eventually, but the hunters had to endure the bitter cold and driving rain until daylight, when they clambered down from the tree and hastened to tell the people of Lakanahali that the tiger had been accounted for. A large party came back to the spot to search for the dead body. American assured them it must be lying somewhere near. But nothing could they find, while the continuous rain of the night before had washed away most of the blood trail, except for a smear on the underside of a leaf here and there. No more cattle were killed after that for a full 6 weeks. This caused the herdsmen of Baylor and Lakanahali to rejoice exceedingly, and an appreciative Patel gave American a handsome reward of 10 rupees. Then a Sholaga woman on the mountaintop, who had gone out to cut a bundle of the long bison grass that grows prolifically on the higher ranges outside the coffee estates, failed to return for her midday meal. Her relatives went looking for her in the afternoon. Eventually they located the grass she had cut and collected, and not far away her side, but of her there was absolutely no trace whatever. Due to the long grass, no tracks of any kind were visible, while a close search failed to reveal any blood marks or other telltale evidence. This was followed in a fortnight by the disappearance of a young man returning from work on one of the coffee estates. A search for him the next day showed he had been ambushed by a tiger while traversing a gully. The animal had sprung down upon him from a bank, and had then carried him along the gully and up a game path leading into a dense shola. The searchers were afraid to follow the tiger's trail, indicated here and there by dried drops of blood that had fallen from the victim, into the shola that stretched down a sloping valley, almost to the foot of the range. So this lad's body, too, was never found. The third would-be victim was luckier and lived to tell the tale. He had been sitting with his back to a tree, his herd of buffaloes grazing around him, when a snort of alarm from one of the bulls had attracted his attention. The boy looked up and noticed the buffaloes were extremely excited. They were gathered in a bunch, facing and gazing intently into the thicket of wattle that reached almost to the spot where he was seated. Having heard of the disappearance of the Sholaga woman and of the recent death of the young man in the jaws of a tiger, the herd boy became alarmed. He sensed his danger and started scrambling up the tree behind him. He had scarcely ascended a few feet when a tiger rushed out of the wattle below and reached up to drag him down. Fortunately, the herd of buffaloes, thoroughly alerted by now, observed the intruder, and, in the manner of buffaloes bred in the jungle, charged the tiger in a body. Hearing the pounding of many hooves behind him, the tiger saw his predicament and leapt back into the cover of the wattle and disappeared. With this third incident, the Sholagas realized that the greatest scourge of the Indian jungles was now upon them. A man-eating tiger. They knew that many of them would not live to see its eventual destruction, for they themselves would be killed before that happened. And with typical Eastern fatalism, they accepted their doom. Meanwhile, to the foot of the mountain range, to the villages of Baylor and Lakanahali and their neighboring hamlets, came information of the latest happenings, carried by breathless runners from the mountaintop. The people of the plains realized that the man-eater would, sooner or later, descend the range and their turn would come to be hunted and devoured. The bells of the little temples in Windy Valley tinkled as pujas were offered for deliverance from the impending scourge. The Patel and the unfortunate American also knew that, indirectly and inadvertently, they were responsible for the 2 deaths that had already occurred and the many that would undoubtedly follow. The coolies in the coffee estates were the first to suffer. Their work of picking and gathering the berries took them into the thickets of the bushes, where the man-eater lay in wait for them. A woman here, a man there, disappeared as day succeeded day. Soon the coolies refused to do the picking and work came to a standstill. They sat idly in their huts at the coolie lines and threatened to leave the estates, if something was not done at once to remove the menace that had come into their lives. The Sholagas on the hilltops locked themselves and their cattle indoors, and the latter soon began to starve. These precautionary measures made hunting difficult for the man-eater. As food on the estates began to grow scarce, he moved down to the plains, forgetting that it was there he had received the wound, high on his left thigh, that had so greatly handicapped him in his hunting. In course of time, the villain, as he was now everywhere known, spread his activities all over the lands of the Windy Valley, while his toll of human lives mounted as week succeeded week. News of the killer spread far and wide, and I found it in the papers at last, and by chance an opportunity to try to eliminate him came my way just about this time. I had suffered a sharp attack of malaria and the doctor had ordered complete rest and absence from work for 10 days. As doctors glibly do, also advised a change. My decision was a quick one. I could certainly think of better from a vacation than a trip into the jungles. Even if the doctor's idea of a rest had been rather different, there was no valid reason why he should be told where I had gone. So I did not tell him. When I arrived at Lakanahali in my Studebaker, the villagers were ready to help with all the information they could give. But this was not of much value. Apparently, the tiger followed no specific line of activity. He snatched his victims where and when he found them. Kills had been reported by the Sholagas inhabiting the hamlets around the villages of Lakanahali, Baylor, and eastwards to Hanur and Ramapuram. Even on the hilltops, where the coolies in the coffee estates had somewhat relaxed their vigilance, one of them would be carried away now and again. I conversed with the Patel and American, and later with some of the local hunters, in an effort to glean as much news as I could about the habits of this animal. But on all sides, the replies were the same. The tiger seemed to be an extraordinarily cunning beast, and a vagrant who wandered at will all over the area, without adopting the habit generally followed by man-eaters, of visiting particular places in routine. That night I camped on the bund of the little tank just south of Lakanahali, where long ago American had shot the sambar that had taken shelter in the water from the wild dogs that were chasing it. I enjoyed to the full the wind of Windy Valley when it started to blow at 10 o'clock. It lulled me into a pleasant and cool slumber till I awoke with a start at 3 a.m. A strange silence was all around me. In spite of the early hour, I felt comparatively warm. The wind had stopped blowing. Could this have been what wakened me? But a moment later, I knew the real answer. From the west of the village, where the foothills of the mountain range, less than 2 miles away, broke the terrain into a number of furrowed nullahs and densely wooded ravines, came the moaning call of a tiger on the prowl. After that I could not sleep, for I accepted that challenge and my mind was busy working out possible ways of meeting the elusive tiger. I was acquainted with the nature of the land where the beast was still calling, having in my younger and far more bloodthirsty years, hunted sloth bears in this region. Rainwater after the monsoons, rushing down from the higher slopes, had carved many watercourses into the earth, all densely choked with undergrowth. It was ideal country for shooting bears, but a most difficult proposition so far as a tiger was concerned. Early next morning I told the Patel I had heard the tiger, and asked his help in purchasing 3 live baits to tie out in the area. He was not very sanguine about the proposition and replied it was a sheer waste of money, as the man-eater sought human prey only and would not deign to look at a young bull or buffalo heifer. But I thought differently. Although he had killed a number of people, the tiger had to live on other food as well. This was the factor that had kept him from adopting the usual habit of man-eaters, that of following a specific beat that might range for 100 miles, but always pursued a fixed pattern, returning to the same spot and from the same direction every time. Even with the Patel's influence, it was 9 a.m. before I obtained these animals, all young buffaloes, and set out with a party of men towards the foothills where the tiger had been calling, taking the baits along with us. We found the tracks eventually, the unmistakable pug marks of a male tiger in his prime, and after a great deal of stumbling about and scrambling through thorn and brush, finally selected 3 spots suitable for tying up each of the heifers. All 3 of these were places where 2 or more ravines joined, so that the tiger in his wanderings along any one of them would stand a better chance of seeing the buffalo. Large trees were scarce in the area, and it happened that there were none at the places I had selected for tying up. I therefore left the problem of constructing a machon or hiding place to be decided after the tiger had made his kill. This was a major error, and with my experience I should have avoided it. Machons, or at least the places for them, should be thought out when tying baits. But the absence of large trees, and I suppose a certain amount of carelessness and overconfidence, prompted me in this instance to make an elementary mistake which even a beginner would scarcely have done, and for which there was no real excuse. Nothing happened that night, and the following morning all the baits were alive. Incidentally, this respite afforded me ample time to select better places where machons or hide-ups of some sort could be constructed in advance, but I suppose I was too lazy to take advantage of it. On the second morning we found one of the buffaloes had been killed and eaten. Pug marks on the bed of the gully showed that the killer was the same tiger that had been calling 2 days earlier. They also indicated that the animal had tried to drag his victim away from where he had slain it, but that the rope by which we had tethered the heifer had held firm, while the tiger had fortunately not thought of biting it through. But where was I to sit the following night to await the killer's return? No tree, large or small, not even a small bush, was available. Seeing my predicament, the Patel, who had come with us, came up with what he considered a brilliant idea. Why not enlist the aid of the bomb makers? If a bomb could be hidden in the udder of one dead cow, surely another could be concealed somewhere in the intestines of a dead buffalo. The wordless stare I gave him in reply caused the question to die on his lips. But in the return look of undisguised scorn he bestowed on me, I could clearly read his thoughts. If the Durai was such a damned fool as to pass up the easiest and best solution available in the circumstances, well, he was just a damned fool. I have told you that we had tied all 3 heifers at places where 2 or more ravines intersected. This particular bait had been tethered at a spot where 3 gullies met. 2 of these were quite large nullahs and came directly from the hills to the west. Roughly, At the point of confluence, they formed with each other an angle of about 30 degrees. The third was a much smaller affair, more in the nature of a ditch, and was about 4 feet deep. If you happened to stand facing the other two nullahs, this shallower ditch came in from the right, or northern side. The reason for its existence was a rise in the ground for some distance in that direction. Rainwater, running down this slope, had eroded the soil over the years, forming a ditch. The slayer's pug marks, plainly visible in the soft earth, showed he had walked down the bed of one of the two deep nullahs coming in from the west, had seen the heifer and killed it, then tried to drag it away. Having not succeeded in his purpose, he had settled down and eaten a large part of his victim and had then gone back the way he had come, up the same nullah. Thus the chances were that, when he returned for his next meal, he would approach along the same nullah. One fact was certain. Due to the absence of a tree, I would be compelled to await the killer's return sitting on the ground, in a hide of sort which we would have to construct. The point to be decided was where to sit. I knew that if we made any kind of hiding place directly along the line of the tiger's return, the chances were that he would spot it long before I even knew of his proximity. Coming back to their kills, tigers do not blunder blindly along, but are most cautious in their approach. This practice is no doubt partly due to the instinct of self-preservation. It was consequently not advisable to construct my hiding place anywhere on the nullah. This left 3 alternatives. The first, a hide at the point of confluence on the further bank of the remaining adjacent nullah, which came in at an angle of 30 degrees. The second, a hide at the point of confluence of the low ditch. Thirdly, a hide at ground level, above and overlooking all 3 gullies. The third proposition offered the advantage of height, whereby I could overlook the remains of the heifer that lay on the bed of the ravine and all approaches to it. But to sit at ground level would make me conspicuous, should the tiger happen to look up as he walked along the bed of any of the ravines. I would be silhouetted against the skyline. I would therefore have to lie prone all night, facing the kill, with my back towards the hills from which the tiger would undoubtedly come. I certainly did not relish the prospect. The choice therefore lay between the first 2 alternatives, and I decided at last upon the second. I would sit at the mouth of the low ditch. I remember now that my reason for not choosing the other alternative was that I thought the tiger might after all approach down the second big nullah, which I have explained came in at a 30-degree angle, rather the way he had used on his retreat the previous night, in which case he might discover my presence. Now came the task of constructing a hide clever enough to deceive the tiger when he reached the spot where the remains of the dead buffalo lay. It would have to be a very smart piece of work, for I knew the tiger would carefully inspect the vicinity before he settled down to his meal. There is a cardinal rule to be borne in mind in constructing any sort of hide or machon. It must match as closely as possible the general topography of the surroundings. For example, hide in the form of a bush would be foolish at a place where bushes were scarce. The leaves, concealing the machon or hide, must be from the same plants or trees as those in the immediate vicinity, and they should not be placed upside down, with their under portions showing. A machon, no matter how concealed, would be an eyesore if built on a tree with few no leaves. As I have related, the ditch I had selected had been hollowed out by rainwater flowing down from the rising ground to the north. Rocks had been isolated along its course here and there, and henna and valari bushes overhung it on both banks. We walked up this ditch for about 200 yards, where I selected 5 large-sized stones and certain henna and valari shrubs. We then carried these rocks to the point of confluence with the 2 nullahs, making 3 trips for the purpose, returning a 4th time to cut the shrubs I had selected. The 5 stones I arranged as naturally as possible, with the shrubs in between them, to form a rough screen facing the remains of the heifer that lay less than 10 yards away. This setup had to be carefully and artistically done to avoid the appearance of a conspicuous wall, at the same time providing sufficient concealment. All this took a long while, so that it was nearly 1 o'clock in the afternoon by the time we had finished. Cutting some more shrubs with which to conceal the remains of the heifer from the vultures while I returned to Lochonholly for lunch, we hurried back to the village. I believe in sitting up over a kill as early as possible rather than arriving at the last moment. No doubt this prolongs the tedium, but to me it is never tedious to sit silently in a jungle. There is so much to see, so much to listen to, so much to be learned that the hours slip by almost faster than I would wish. The Sholagas who had accompanied me in the morning refused to go with me again. They said that, after leaving me at the hiding place, they would have to return alone, and this would be dangerous. Supposing the man-eater was watching our movements and attacked them on their way back to the village unarmed? I certainly could not blame them, so I returned alone, reaching the kill by 3:30 p.m., where I first removed the shrubs with which we had concealed the carcass of the buffalo, and carried them back the 200 yards down the watercourse from where we had cut them earlier. Lopped branches or shrubs should never be left lying about in the vicinity of a kill. Tigers are suspicious of the least thing, and such objects make them aware of the presence of human beings, and they not return to a kill where they may suspect an ambush. Even man-eaters, although they devour people, are inherently afraid of the human race and will hesitate to come to a spot where they feel men may be in hiding. If he thinks he is being hunted, the average man-eater turns into an abject coward and does his best to get away. As it happened, my early sit-up on this occasion was rewarded by a quite unexpected event. Hardly an hour had elapsed when a movement of the grass growing on the bank of the second nullah before me, the one that the tiger had not used, caught my eye. Watching very carefully, I saw what appeared to be a pair of short, upright objects projecting behind the clump of grass. A fact that struck me as singular was that they seemed to be always equidistant from each other. When one moved, the other moved, always in the same way, always in the same direction. Sometimes they rose a little higher, and at other times sank from view behind the grass, only to rise again. They seemed to be watching me as intently as I was watching them. What could these two strange creatures be? For a full half-hour I watched those two objects. At first I thought them to be a pair of small birds. Strange birds, indeed, to move always in unison, to remain always the same distance apart. Then the solution flashed to my mind. Some animal was watching me, and what I was looking at were the tips of its ears. Could it be the man-eater? It must be. I gripped my loaded rifle with mounting excitement, waiting for the next move in this strange game of spying. Nothing happened for another 10 minutes. I remained absolutely motionless, hardly daring to breathe. At last, the 2 points started to rise higher above the grass. I saw the top of the head that joined the 2 ears. Then 2 baleful eyes glared at me. But the watcher was no tiger. It was a panther. How could this be, I wondered. Were the Sholagas all wrong? Perhaps the man-eater was a panther after all, and not a tiger. But the heifer had been clearly killed by a tiger. The pug marks confirmed that, and the manner in which it had been eaten. Finally, the panther stood upright, still glaring in my direction. Then he walked through the grass and down the bank onto the bed of the second nullah. He was still looking at my hide. I sat still. The panther was abreast of the remains of the heifer now. He hesitated a while, turning his head towards the carcass. Then he walked up to it. But he did not eat. Apprehensively, he kept glancing in my direction and then all around him. He even looked back intently over his shoulder along the way he had come. By his nervous movements, I could divine his thoughts. Something worried him about my hide. Either he could see me or he suspected my presence behind my screen of boulders and shrubs. Perhaps he noticed these had not been there when he had last passed this way. Further, his furtive glances around and behind clearly showed that he knew he was about to steal from a kill rightly belonging to his overlord, a tiger. He also knew that, if he was caught in the act, his life would be forfeit. With another glance around, the panther finally bent his head to eat. Then at the last moment his courage failed him. He emitted a low snarl and backed away. The animal half turned, maybe with the intention of departing, when he thought of, or observed, my hide again. He stared in my direction more intently than ever. In turn, I sat motionless, even holding my breath. Curiosity got the better of the panther at this point. He came over to investigate. I did nothing but grip my rifle more tightly. He came as close as 2 yards before he finally discovered me. His reactions were amusing and terrifying. I could see surprise, anger, fear, then terror register in his eyes. He snarled. He sank to the ground, head between his paws with his rear sticking up ludicrously behind, his tail standing even higher. I thought he was going to charge and swung the rifle to my shoulder, aiming between his eyes. My finger was beginning to press the trigger. At that moment the panther's courage failed ignominiously for the second time. He somersaulted backwards, recovered and fled. In 2 bounds he had gone. Indeed, I was glad I had come early that afternoon, for this was a curious experience and I learned from it a lot. Firstly, the hide I was sitting in was obviously a flop. The panther had noticed it from the start. Secondly, I had had another lesson in the value of sitting absolutely motionless. The panther had approached to within 6 feet before his keen eyes had been able to detect me. Thirdly, I had witnessed an interesting spectacle of a panther's obvious dread of his bigger cousin, the tiger. Fourthly, I had received clear proof of the average panther's fear of a human being, even at close quarters. Fifthly, I cursed myself for the fool I had been in not tying my baits at places where there were convenient trees in which to erect macans in the event of a kill. I now had the prospect of sitting on the ground all night to await the return of a man-eating tiger, in a hide that was so obvious in nature and character that it had been discovered and held in suspicion by a harmless passing panther, right from the very start. But how would the man-eater react? I was pleased and I was disgusted. The remainder of the evening drew slowly to a close. The scrub jungle all around appeared alive with the lesser birds of the wild. Partridges called in all directions, and bevies of quail scuttled down and across the nullahs, digging in the soft warm sand for insects and worms. A nervous hare loped to the edge of the ravine, looked down at the scattered remains of the heifer, turned around and bobbed away. The jungle proper commenced at the base of the foothills, half a mile distant, and the cooling breezes that floated down from the heights above carried the calls of roosting peafowl and the scent of faraway jungle flowers. The sun had disappeared long before behind the towering range to the west, and it grew prematurely dark by 6 o'clock. In another half an hour it was night. For my bad luck there would be no moon, although the stars came out one by one and soon dusted the blue-black sky with a myriad trembling points of light. An instinct, a silent voice, then began to warn me urgently. I could feel the danger, strongly and critically, although there was apparently nothing happening to give cause for my alarm. All was as silent as the grave. And then in a flash it came to me, the reason for my apprehension. The silence that had suddenly fallen over everything was unnatural. Not even a cricket chirped. There could be only one explanation. Something was passing by. Something that frightened all the lesser creatures of the world into a terrified silence. That something could only be a tiger. I strained my ears to catch the slightest sound and my eyes to probe the faint light in the nullah bed before me. Not a sound was to be heard, not an object moved. The carcass of the heifer formed a faint dark blur on the lighter background of the ravine sand. It was beginning to smell horribly. I stared at it intently. The minutes passed. They seemed to stretch into hours. The feeling of imminent danger that screamed its warning to me increased. I was moved by an almost irresistible urge to spring from my hiding place and to run away as fast and far possible from this horrible and dangerous spot. With difficulty I controlled my nerves. There appeared no reason for the strange terror that had overtaken me. Everything was quiet and peaceful. It was early, too. My watch showed only 7:50 p.m. I thought of the panther's behavior and of how he had discovered or somehow sensed the existence of my hide. The thought made me even more afraid. Had the tiger discovered me in the same way? Was he even now creeping forward for the final spring? The answer came in the form of a shattering roar a few yards behind me, followed by a piercing scream and the sound of heavy bodies floundering and scuffling in the underbrush. The shriek was repeated, accompanied by the most horrible snarls and growls as the tiger drove home his merciless attack. In a flash, I realized what was happening. The man-eater had indeed been approaching his kill, but by the most unexpected route. He had been coming along the very ditch in which I was hiding, and within a few seconds would have crept up behind me. The sixth sense, which had so often warned me of grave danger, had again tried to give its message. But my material senses had been too dull to interpret the warning correctly, at least, so far as the position of the approaching danger was concerned. The dying screams of the animal he had encountered on the way, and whose presence had undoubtedly saved my life, were still to be heard, but faintly now, as it gasped out its life between the tiger's jaws. A wild pig, probably a sow. No doubt, she had come down from the hills towards the cultivated land, bordering the road, when she had very unluckily, but most luckily for me, met the tiger. Silence ensued, followed after a short while by the crunching sound of bones and the satisfied rumbling, purring growls the tiger as he tucked into the meal. Apparently the feast was taking place within 50 yards of where I sat, and yet there nothing I could do and nothing to be seen. To attempt to move would be to betray my presence to the killer at once. No matter how carefully I might try, I was certain to make some sort of noise. Had there been moonlight, there might have been some chance of seeing the tiger over the tops of the intervening bushes, if I stood on tiptoe and craned my neck, but in the existing conditions there was not a hope of doing that. All I could do was to turn around stealthily, slowly, with infinite caution, to face the direction from which the sounds were coming. So long as those sounds continued, I was safe. It was when they ceased that I would have to look out. For then, the tiger might decide to continue walking down the shallow watercourse to investigate his earlier kill, the dead heifer, and perhaps taste a mouthful or two by way of a dessert after his banquet of pork. I knew that if the tiger decided to follow this course, he would discover me before he ever reached the dead buffalo. There was then every possibility that I would form the dessert instead. The feast continued for 2 hours, and it was still going on when suddenly the sounds could be heard no more. It was exactly 10 o'clock and the winds of Windy Valley were beginning to blow. Right on time, that strange and to me inexplicable phenomenon that I had welcomed and enjoyed so often began again. But I did not and could not enjoy it then. I heard the distant howl of the approaching blast as it advanced down the hillsides, whistling through the treetops to a rising crescendo. It came ever closer and in a minute was upon me, a screaming, rushing, roaring violence. Windy Valley was living up to its name, and because of it I could no longer hear the tiger, nor would I be able to hear him for the next 5 hours, until 3 in the morning. He might be miles away, or a few yards. It made not one iota of difference, for I would not be able to hear him, or any other sound, for a long while to come. Infinitely worse was the fact that, as I was sitting in a position between the tiger and the direction from which the wind was blowing, although he could not scent me, his acute powers of hearing would definitely pick up any sound I made. Altogether, I was in an unenviable plight. That wind blew on and on. Nothing could I hear but its continuous, compelling song in the undergrowth and bushes that covered the broken region of ravines in which I had taken up my position. The minutes dragged by as, moment by moment, I expected the man-eater to discover my presence and put an end to me. It grew colder and colder. My teeth began to chatter, and I knew that this was yet another sound that might betray me. The hours of mental agony and fear dragged on as I glanced at my watch 100 times. At last, it was 11 o'clock and, after what seemed an eternity, midnight. I grew more alert than ever. It was a little later that, above the movement and noise of the wind in the surrounding grass, I thought I could hear the bushes swish a little louder, as if brushed by some large animal moving through them. I gripped my rifle and stared intently into the darkness where the tiger had been eating. Then it was that I noticed that the sound seemed to be coming from somewhere to my left. You will remember how I had taken up my position facing the ravine and the dead heifer, and how, when I had heard the tiger killing the wild sow to my right, I had stealthily turned around to face that way. Now this strange, swishing sound that was undoubtedly growing louder came from the direction of the main ravine and the dead heifer, which were now to my left, and not from where the tiger had been feasting. Furtively I turned my head to look, and, after staring at the faint area of luminosity where the sands of the ravine reflected the starlight, I saw a black shadow rapidly advancing down the nullah up which the tiger had retreated the previous day. But this shadow was the size of a rock. Then the answer came to me in a flash. Here was an elephant. The elephant drew closer and eventually passed within a few feet. I had turned my head right around and was now looking over my right shoulder. I could just see his tusks against the black shadow of the body behind. But, close as he was, the tusker was upwind and was quite unaware of my proximity. Had the breeze been blowing in the opposite direction, he could not fail to have scented me. But the tiger soon discovered the presence of the elephant. He growled and snarled, and I could hear him above the howling of the wind. So could the elephant. He had scarcely passed me when the tiger had begun to growl. The elephant stopped abruptly, swung around to face the sound, and struck his trunk twice against the ground, before curling the member tightly inwards out of harm's way. Still glancing fearfully over my shoulder, I could see it all. The dark bulk of the huge beast was clearly outlined against the light-colored sands of the ravine in the glow from the thousands of stars that looked serenely down upon the strange scene. The elephant scraped one of his forefeet vigorously upon the sand, raising a cloud of dust. His ears ceased flapping and were drawn tightly against his head, while his tail stuck rigidly out behind him. To me, the signs were clear enough. Although elephants and tigers usually avoid each other, this particular pachyderm did not intend to be chased ignominiously away by any tiger that chose to challenge him. My position had now become extremely precarious. Should these two engines of destruction decide to do battle, I would be right in the middle of the fray. In their fury, they would rush and charge at each other indiscriminately. I was in fearful danger either of being trampled upon by the elephant or discovered by the tiger and torn to ribbons in his rage. Further thoughts of this kind were dispelled by the tiger. With a loud woof, he came leaping through the bushes in a series of short bounds till he reached the ravine a few feet below the junction of its two higher branches and at the place where the remains of the half-devoured heifer were lying. Evidently, he had not forgotten his earlier kill while feasting on the sow, and hearing the elephant near it, had jumped to the conclusion that the trespasser was interfering with his property. No doubt, this was what caused him to growl and snarl in the first instance, and when the elephant answered the challenge, had made him rush out so precipitately. The tiger was once more to my left, scarcely 20 feet away, while the elephant, who had been walking down the ravine, had shifted almost behind me, perhaps 50 to 60 feet from the tiger. I could not watch both animals, so I concentrated on the tiger. He sank down on his belly, snarling and growling terribly, while his tail lashed from side to side behind him. In another second, something was going to happen. Either the tiger or the elephant would work up enough courage to charge, perhaps both. Whatever happened, I would be in the direct line of battle. I knew the tiger was watching the elephant's every move, and I knew the elephant was watching the tiger. In this lay my last and only chance. For a few moments this close watching game would continue, and then one or other or both the contestants would have reached the point of no return and would launch an attack that would certainly eliminate me as an eyewitness of its conclusion. The stock of my rifle was already against my shoulder, and I pressed the button of the torch with my left thumb. The bright beam fell on the tiger, startling him and causing him to stare back in mute surprise. Then I fired, and as the great feline rolled in the dust, I worked the underlever of my rifle rapidly and pressed the trigger twice more. I could not afford to take chances with a wounded man-eater. The tiger lay sprawled in almost the very spot where my first shot had taken him. He was kicking feebly when I remembered the elephant behind me and craned my head sharply to the left. But there was nothing to be seen. The elephant had fled. The tiger had stopped kicking by the time I had turned to him again, and I knew that he was dead. The reaction from the prolonged nervous tension I had been through for well over 2 hours left me feeling sick and with a severe headache. But now the winds of Windy Valley really came to my aid. Their strong, cooling balm soon swept the headache away, and I sat back contentedly to luxuriate in their freshness and to watch again the splendor of the stars that crowded the heavens above, throwing their thin light on the bushes in the bed of the ravine and on the dark form of the dead tiger. I fell asleep. I awoke later with a start. All around me was a deathly silence. The stars had disappeared, hidden behind a black canopy of clouds. I wondered what had happened, why everything was so strangely still. Then I glanced at my watch and knew the answer. It was 10 minutes after 3, and the strange winds had ceased to blow as abruptly as they had begun. In a little while it began to rain, so I got up and started walking towards the village, following the beam of my torchlight across the many ditches and nullahs that intervened and the bushes that grew between them. I was soaking wet when I reached Lakanahali, but I was also very happy, for with a rare stroke of good luck, I had accomplished my mission within a few hours. I could now really take the rest my doctor had advised. When I woke again, it was 9 o'clock and the sun was shining brightly. Also, I was not so happy now, for the thought came almost as soon as I awoke. Suppose I had not accounted for the man-eater after all? Maybe the tiger I had shot was just a harmless beast, for it had killed a heifer and then a wild pig. I had no evidence it was the man-eater. The Sholagas crowded into the village during the afternoon to see the tiger after we had brought it in, and they affirmed that the animal was indeed the villain of Windy Valley, but still I had no proof and was not entirely happy. A day later, I returned to Bangalore, and for 6 months after that, there were no human kills in any of the regions where the elusive tiger had been operating. So, probably after all, it was the man-eater that I got that memorable night, while I have often wished that I had had the chance to witness the end of the fight, to which I was so unfortunately compelled to put an end, even before it had begun.